Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of everyone here, we are glad to welcome ma'am. Ma'am Prithvi Saha is assistant professor in the Department of Physics, and we are glad to listen to lecture.
Thank you. What's your name?
Samiksha.
Shamiksha. Thank you for this nice introduction. So, good morning, everyone. I hope that you are having a very nice time here and you are interacting with other people, had many other interesting lectures, and I hope that that intrigued your curious mind to learn and know more about things, right? Basic science, okay? So, of course, you have had, so today, first I should first introduce myself a little bit more. So, my name is Ipshita Shaha, and my research interest is primarily in the field of what we call particle physics. Have you heard of particle physics? Yes, okay, everyone knows particles is a very known thing. So, of course, the idea of this particle physics, the whole idea of this theory, of this research direction, is to understand the fundamental constituents of the universe. Okay, so it's a very simple question that we ask from the ancient times, that what are we made up of? Okay, so we would like to understand. First, we ask the question, is it possible that everything that we see around us are only made up of some fundamental things, some fundamental constituents, and it's just differently arranged in different ways, okay, that make up the different kind of things. So for that, then if this is true, then what are these fundamental building blocks that made up us, you, me, everyone, the universe and everything? So that is the question, the simple question that we try to address in the problem or the research direction that we call the particle physics. So my or our, the scientists or the people, I should not say scientists, the people who work on particle physics, they would always try to find out the smallest thing in the world that make up this universe. Okay. So now, if so, how many such kind of elementary particles do you know so far? Okay, so you know everything. Maybe, okay, maybe, so you had idea, at least you know the names of everything. But this lecture, I would like to take a journey from this early 17th century to today, until today, this 21st century, and the um, the journey that we took to understand and to discover all these kind of new constituent particles. Okay, so at least you said that you know electrons, and we'll come to that part, quarks, what are these things. Okay, so now the story that we are going to discuss today trace back to this guy. Have you heard of this guy? So his name is Democritus, and he is an ancient Greek philosopher. So Democritus and his friends, and later someone called Leucippus in ancient Rome, these were the very early, the first particle physicists, the first theoretical particle physicists, because at that time there was no idea of something like experimental particle physics. And why do I say that these are the first theoretical particle physics? Because at that time what philosophers did, they think. Okay, so they pass the time and they think about complicated questions. And the idea that these guys and his friends proposed, that maybe whatever we see here, the living beings, the earth, the water, whatever material that are surrounding us, maybe these are, you know what, these are not different things, these are all made up of very small things, and they call these small things as atoms. Okay, so the word atoms come from this ancient Greece. And then they said that okay, so if I arrange this atom in many different way, so in a way of arranging will give me this guy, in a way of arranging the atoms will give me this chair. So even the living and the non-living things, everything can be made up of something called the fundamental stuffs. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, this word atoms was stolen by chemists. But and we know what do we mean or what do we refer when we say atom. We say by atom refer to the chemical element of different kind of chemical things, like even in the periodic tables. But these were known as the atomists, and they first started thinking about the possibility of the fundamental constituents of everything. Okay, so atomist. So the question that I started with, what are we made of? Now, first of all, let's try to understand the various kind of the vast size scales of matters that we can see. So it can start from crystals, like crystals of salt or crystal of quartz, and the scale for those kind of crystal molecules can be within some millimeter to centimeter. Okay, so now if you zoom in to that molecule, what you see the atoms, and the scale of the atoms now goes back to 10 to the power 8 centimeter, 10 to the minus 8 centimeter. If you can see it correctly, I don't know. So it's of the order of 1 angstrom, right? Angstrom you have learned, yeah. So in the atom I see, now if I want to zoom in further inside the atom, what happens? So you see with the decrease in, can you hear me? Is it working? Okay. This is this fan. Oh, okay. But this is not working, I think. So I am already loud. Hello. Yeah. Now it's working. Yeah. So the scales that we go to. So I'll refer to this side. So from molecule to atom, I go from few centimeter or millimeter to very small like angstrom order. And then I zoom in further in the atom, I see electrons orbiting the nucleus, and I go further and zoom in there. So I see the nucleus, and there the radius or the diameter of the nucleus is what we call of the order of 1 femtometer. Okay, femtometer means 10 to the power minus 15 meter. Okay, so now this nucleus is made up of what I call the nucleons. Nucleons is what you refer to protons and neutrons. Okay, so these are protons, neutrons, and even until certain time it was thought of these protons and neutrons are the fundamental elements. But now we know that even these are not fundamental or elementary particles, these are composites. And then I can even zoom in, or I can see the substructure of this proton or all these nucleons. So there are various other kind of things similar to protons and neutrons, and those are made up of more elementary stuffs. And those stuffs are what you refer to already, quarks.
How do we know they exist?
So this is the thing that I'm going to explain to you in this lecture. You have to keep patience a little bit more. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here, that the scale, we need to see the smaller and smaller and smaller entity of the things. So we need to zoom in. That means we need to see microscopically. So what we basically need, a stronger and stronger microscope, such that the smaller and smaller things we can see. Okay, and the scales. Now here you see something I have written. Actually, this is I have taken from something called the CERN collaboration. So it was given in their website, and they have written some energy scales corresponding to each length scale. So there is some, you don't have to think about it now, but just to make you understand that similar to what you have learned so far, that there are several kind of units of measurement, CGS unit, SI units. So there is something called the natural units, in which we can actually, with some assumption of parameters, and those parameters are, one of the parameters is the speed of light, with some assumption or scaling factor, I can relate length, time, mass, everything in terms of energy. So I know that electron volt is a unit of energy. So it is just for the sake of simplification or the sake of easiness that we, all the length scale we go, it can refer to the energy scales, but it goes inversely. So when I say that I want to zoom in, I want to go to very small length scale, that means I need more and more energy. Okay, that relates to higher and higher energy. So it is easily understandable, because I know that to knock down an electron from an outer orbit of an atom, then energy I need much more energy to take out a proton from the nucleus, because I want to go a smaller and smaller distance. Okay, so this is the fundamental idea of these things, and these are some, I think, experimental facilities that is needed. So basically, this collider and this thing, large accelerators, what is written here, are all fundamentally or basically, you can think of these as microscope, because what we do in microscope, we see with the help of the lens, we see small things. Here also we try to see the small things. Okay, now the, yes.
What were mesons, baryons, and
Yes. What are these? Yeah, I'm going to explain these things. Okay. So I'd like to start from so at the very early days, even before Isaac Newton, they did not know about this baryons. So let's just take an historical journey. You know, the history of science is an important part of learning, because until you know what steps you took that makes you a failure, you are not going to be a success in the future. Anyway, so we have to first start from the understand how we get to know about the structure of atoms. Okay, so after the birth of modern times, the idea of atoms came to be used as a basis of quantitative theories of matter. Okay, so even in the 17th century, Isaac Newton, he tried to explain that the gas spread out. If I keep a gas inside a container, let's say, the gas spread out, and he tried to explain that thing, the expansion of these gases, or if I heat up a gas, I know that it expanded, and that expansion is as the outrush of the atoms into empty space. Now, only in the early 19th century, what John Dalton explained, he said that this all you know, that the ratio of the weights of chemical elements can be equated with the ratio of the, in terms of the relative weights of the atoms of these elements. Okay. But by the end of 19th century, the idea of the atoms had become familiar to most of the scientists, but it was not universally accepted. Okay, people were not interested to think about this idea of having a fundamental building blocks. The general acceptance that the matter or the nature of matter consists of this fundamental structure, the structure of atom, it only came about once we discovered the constituents of the atom. We would start seeing what are these atoms made up of, the electron and the atomic nucleus. So, just to revise you, of course, you all know that fundamentally atoms are like has a core part. So most of the mass of the atom is concentrated in the core, which contains these protons and neutrons. And there are electrons that orbits around this nucleus. So as it happens that two atoms can form a molecule, a different molecule, by just lending, trading, or sharing these electrons in the orbits, right? So the way it is, you know better than me that how all these different chemical bonds is formed, whether we share, it's different in carbon atom and it's carbon molecule and it's different in sodium chloride molecule, let's say. So that difference is whether we share the electrons or we trade the electrons between the orbits. Okay. Now, also we know that now at present we know, because thanks to Bohr and all the development of this atomic theory, that electrons orbit with definite energy. So each electron orbit has a definite energy, and when one electron transition from one orbit to another orbit, so either it give up energy or it has to absorb energy, and because of that, whether either we see an emission of light or an absorption of light. Okay, that also lead to something called an atomic spectra. So why I am saying this? Because this is going to, we are going to talk about this in next kind of slides. Now, before, so the first of the elementary that was identified was of course the electron. So do you know who discovered the electron? J.J. Thomson. J.J. Thomson. In which year? Around 1897. Yeah, it's the beginning of the 18th century, 20th century, 19th century. Okay, so but before, we have to understand that before Thomson discovered the electron, what was the general idea about this electricity thing at that time? So before we take up the story of the discovery of the electrons, so we will have to think about, we will have to go back and have a flashback of this whole idea, nature of electricity. Okay, so it was very well known that if I take two different kind of things, let's say I take a glass rod and a silk cloth, and then rub that silk cloth with the glass rod, and then I use the glass rod with some other material, right? Then what happens? That material, that glass rod, which attracts those. So, for example, here in this picture that I have shown, that you use a wooden comb and you comb your dry hair, and then use that wooden comb to piece of small papers, and it will attract the paper. So the initial idea that was there in the early 17th century was that, so this is, they had this something is electricity is there, but they did not understand it's some kind of an intrinsic property of the matter. What they thought that maybe this electricity is some kind of fluid, okay, and this fluid is possible to transfer from one object to another object. And because I can see that there are two different kind of nature of this electricity, either two objects or two substances attract each other, or even it can repel each other, then that means there must be two different kind of electricity. And at that time they named these two different type of electricity as vitreous and resinous electricity. Okay, so you can think of this vitreous electricity as the positive electricity, and the resinous electricity is a negative electricity. So this kind of two fluid theory was first put forward by Stephen Gray and a French scientist, his name is Dufay. Okay, so and people were kind of happy to explain that this fluid kind of theory, although the idea of fluid was not explicitly mentioned by these people, but the people who were working around this time with the electricity. And there was a very big hype with this kind of static electricity. Now, do you know this guy? Benjamin Franklin. Correct. So the person who comprehensively and influentially challenged the idea of this two fluid theory of electricity is this guy. What Franklin said, he supposed that electricity is something that ordinary matter holds into itself. It is there in the matter, and this electricity, when either it can be there as an excess or as an deficiency. So when I rub two things together, whether the matter that holds the electricity, either it can take up some kind of this electricity from other matter and it gets an excess in electricity, or else it gives up some of the electricity that it had in there, and then it becomes a deficient in electricity. And so he referred to this deficiency of electricity as the negative electricity. So for example, if I rub a silk cloth with a glass rod, then what happens? The electron from, now I know that I can talk about this electron, but at that time there was no idea about this electron. So they were really thinking about one kind of a fluid, and that we cannot actually see, but it's there because I can see the consequences of the transfer of these fluids. So the fluid from the glass rod transferred to the silk. So silk cloth becomes an excess with the electricity, and the glass rod becomes a deficient of electricity. Okay, so the glass rod become negative. Now, since it is negative, now you take this glass rod to some other matter that holds electricity. So because it's negative, then the other electricity, there is a unlike type of electricity, negative and positive. So either it attracts, but if you take two different kinds, so if you rub silk cloth with one glass rod and another glass rod, and you try to take them together, and you see that they repel each other, because like type of electricity now repels each other. So the repulsion of this electricity was not actually explained by Benjamin Franklin. It was explained by someone called Aepinus. But his one fluid theory was very much, it was kind of acceptable. But now at the present, we know that actually both of the theories are correct, right? So if you think about it this way, there are not only negative electricity, there is also positive electricity. So also electron, and we can think of holes or positron. So the transfer on the excess of electrons or an excess of positron will give us this two different kind of repulsion or the attraction of among the matters. So he is the first guy who mentioned that the amount of, because he thinks that the matter holds this kind of electricity, it is kind of inherent in the matter. So the amount of electricity in any body we have, and he termed it as the electric charge of the body. Okay, and he also introduced the fundamental hypothesis of conservation of energy. You think about this is so early. It's even, he died in 1719, and he's talking about these things in early 17th century, and he's talking about the conservation of charge, and he says that electricity is never created or neither it is destroyed, but it is something that only transferred. Okay. Now Franklin's, now that today we say the electron carries negative charge, is actually what started from Franklin's idea. Franklin's assumption that the most common carriers, when the glass rod that is that have a not a deficiency in electricity, is carries by some kind of this kind of fluid, and that carry the negative electric charge, is what we still refer that the electron has the negative energy charge, electric charge, sorry. Okay, so the study of the nature of electricity, and specifically the electric discharge, was what interested people most at that time. So they already knew the natural phenomena of electric discharge, they could see itself, and the earliest known and the spectacular sort of this electric discharge is of course the lightning. I know that electric discharge and we see the lightning, and even Franklin with an amazing experiment, he tries to work with this electricity. Okay, but the problem is that this lightning, it has huge electricity and is not safe, and it is not under control. It's an uncontrollable natural phenomena, but people were so interested in studying this kind of electric discharge property. So but then they realize that okay, we can make a controllable environment so that we can study these electric discharge phenomena. What they see, that if I take a glass tube and I take out the gas out of this glass tube, almost 1/60th of the air pressure that was inside, the 1/60th less air pressure than the normal air pressure, if I do that, then what I see, that if I now connect this glass tube with some, all they had is static electricity, right? So they just rub things up. Now they know that if I connect this, now this electricity will flow with their idea, and this frictional electricity they attach to this end of the glass tube, and what happens, electric current flows. Okay, so when electric current flows through the gas, what the electrons do, they knock out the gas atoms and they give up some of their energy, and that's why we see an emission of the light. So that is the basic fundamental idea of the electric discharge. But the importance of this electric discharge phenomena in the history of science is not in the light that is given off, but in the electric current itself, because at that time they had no idea of this, they only have seen this static electricity. Okay, but the problem is that at that time the difficulty was into reducing the air pressure inside the gas container. How do you do that? Because now you know how do we do that. How can we do that? Some vacuum pump we use. So the more strength the pump has, the more air I can extract out using that vacuum pump, the less air pressure will be there. Okay, so Thomson first tried studying the velocity of these something called a cathode rays, and the discovery was cathode rays was first made in 1869 by two German physicists, Hittorf and Pluecker. Okay, so this discovery of cathode rays was only present, I should mention, is due to one scientist named Geisler, because he was able to discover or made something called a Geisler pump, a vacuum pump, which was so strong that it can extract out most of the, or lower most of the air pressure inside the glass container. So what happens if, so Pluecker observed that if and when we can almost evacuated all air from this tube, so the electric discharge light was not there. Of course, almost disappeared, because there were no more gas inside, So there's no way that the electron knocks out and gives off energy and discharges the light and emits light. But what happens that a greenish glow appeared at the end of the glass tube. Okay, and then this kind of experimental facilities that now we know as what we call the cathode ray tube. So we connect a negative electricity plate and we connect a positive electricity plate inside a glass tube which has almost no air inside, and we see that if we connect these two plates, then there is a greenish glow inside, and this greenish glow that we see, this light, is not dependent on where you put this anode plate. It will always be there, and this ray is always towards this positive electricity plate. Okay? So it was not known at that time. Now we know that these rays are just a stream of electrons. Now here I should mention, although I am talking about the inventor of this cathode ray tube, this Hittorf and Flacker, but many people have tried to work with these things, and the terminology that came for this cathode and anode and all these things, this was given by Michael Faraday, who is one of the who has foundationally contributed to all this field of electromagnetism. Okay, so I'm not able to, at that time there were so many great works done by great scientists, it was not possible to cite all of them, but anyway we'll try to at least follow the okay. So Thomson, now comes the discovery of these electrons, and you already mentioned that in 1897 Thomson discovered the electron. What did he do? So Thomson first started to measure the velocity of these cathode rays. Okay, he sees there's a stream of ray coming from cathode plate to the end of the tube, and then he says that okay, if it's a stream of rays, then can we measure the velocity of this? So I switch on the electricity and I see by what time, I use some watch, by what time the ray falls into the end of the glass tube. Okay, but he was not very successful at that time. What he measured is usually inaccurate, because they were the facilities were not that precise. Okay, so then he realized that this cathode ray, the cathode ray that we see, if we put an electric and a magnetic field, then there is a deflection in the ray. So whether the ray was initially straight from the cathode, is deflected towards the direction of the electric and magnetic field, and that gives an idea that this ray carries some negative charge, because it always attracted to the positive electric field or this magnetic field. So the ray particles are subjected, and then what he did, so this is the schematic diagram of what was used by Thomson. So he used this cathode tube. I cannot actually see this. So there is a cathode tube, and then there is a anode collimator. I say collimator because such that the cathode rays, because it's a negative charge, it always tries to flow towards the positive charge plate. So it follows that path. So I place this anode in between, and then I put this electric field and magnetic field perpendicular to the direction of the cathode ray velocity, the flow of the cathode ray direction. And what I see, that then there is at the end of the tube there is a deflection, and he started measuring the displacement of this ray produced by the forces acting on these rays by measuring the distance between the locations of the glowing spot. So if I don't put this, if I switch off this electromagnetic field, then what happens? The ray will go straight. But if I just switch it on, then the ray will move from here to here. And he wanted to measure this length, this deflection distance. Now this is the formula that he derived, and we are going to try to derive this formula with whatever basic understanding we have from Newton's second law. So he only used Newton's second law, And he says that see, the displacement is nothing but the ratio of these parameters, where F is the forces that acting on the ray, small l is the length of the deflection region. And what is this deflection region? So this region where we applied this electric and magnetic field perpendicular to the direction of the motion of this ray, this is the small deflection region. And then this whole region, which is much larger than the deflection region, where there is no force and the ray follows its initial velocity, is what I call the drift region. Okay, so this capital L is the length of the drift region, and then V is the velocity of the ray particle, and M is the mass of the ray particle. So how did he calculate this? So let me just, can I have a chalk or anything? Okay. So all we know from Newton's second law, so of course you all know that is 11th standard, right? So you all know the Newton's second law is F equals to ma. So force is defined, can be defined in such a way that for a particular mass, this force can give rise to an acceleration. Okay. Now this force or acceleration, probably you know that these are vector quantities. Do you know these are vector? So they have a sense of direction, in which direction you are applying the force, and in which direction the particle or the whatever object you are applying the force on is moving. So the direction of this acceleration of this particle is in the direction of the force that we applied. So that is the basic principle of Newton's second law. Now here, what force are we applying to the cathode ray particle? Is the electric force or the magnetic force. Either I am applying an electric field or I am applying a magnetic field. So because and that field is applied on the perpendicular direction of the velocity of the initial direction of velocity of the particle. So if so the ray particle is moving and I am applying in the perpendicular direction the electric field, what will happen? The ray particle will feel the force and it will accelerate it in the direction of the force, okay, which is in the perpendicular direction of its motion. So the velocity that initially had only one direction will now have a perpendicular component towards the direction of the force, okay, and we can calculate. So this velocity, I know velocity is what? Acceleration by time, okay. Sorry, acceleration, velocity, sorry, my bad. Time, velocity by time is acceleration. Yeah, so velocity is distance by time and acceleration is velocity by time. So acceleration is distance by time square. Anyway, so if the ray particle feels an acceleration towards the perpendicular direction of the force, or the direction of the force, then the velocity will also get a perpendicular component, okay, and that perpendicular component of velocity will be the time duration as long as we are applying the force into the ray particle, and then this is the acceleration. And this acceleration I know because of this force, so is F by M. M is the mass of the ray particle, okay. Now suppose initially the particle has a velocity, it has a velocity, that's why it reaches the end of the glass tube, and that velocity is V, and I know that now in the apparatus I have a deflection region where I am applying the force, and then all this is my drift region, and the length of this deflection and drift region was assigned to be small l and capital L. So now if I say that the particle is within this deflection region for a small time t, and the length of the deflection region is small l, then I know that this small time t will be the length of the deflection region by the initial velocity of the particle, because velocity is distance by time. So the ray particle has a velocity v, and that is distance, deflection region, and the time duration within which the particle is in that region, correct? So what I can do, I can replace this t here, and I can find out the perpendicular velocity as small l by v dot f by m, so on and so forth. Now I know that the drift region is the region where there is no force, so the particle is already deflected, so the velocity component already has a perpendicular component, but it's still moving with this velocity v in the drift region, correct? So the time that it's spent within this region, the time that is spent, if I say that for capital T time the particle remains in the drift region, then that should be the length of the drift region where there is no force divided by the velocity, which is still the velocity v. Okay? So the
How is force constant throughout this entire process?
which constant m?
No, how is force constant throughout this process?
So the force is applied by myself. This is the electric field force or the magnetic field.
No, but that depends on the distance from the.
Why?
We are setting up a uniform magnetic field.
Yes. So I'm going to, I haven't put any expression for force here. I'm saying it's a force, constant force. Okay. So the displacement will be the time that is spent in the drift region and with the velocity in the perpendicular direction. So the perpendicular velocity component is why it has a deflection. The cathode ray is a deflection or displaced, and so this will be because it spent time capital T in this drift region. Okay. So this displacement, now you replace all this T, which is L by V, and V perpendicular is small l by V and F by M. So this is what Thomson also found, that is F L by M V square. Okay. Now, so now I know that from the original path, the particle is displaced, the ray particle is displaced because of some force, and as he correctly mentioned, what is this force? Okay, so what Thomson did, he tried to measure the ratio of charge and the mass by using this deflection formula. Okay. So now I know that if the cathode, now I have to explicitly use the force that I am using on the ray particle, and if I am using an electric field and the force because of that electric field, so I know that the F electric force will be the charge of the ray particle, and then this is my electric field E. Again, these are vector quantities, but I am not writing it explicitly in vectors. Okay. So of course you understand that Thomson in 1897, I'm writing this EE, but this has, we should owe this F electric force by due to many other great scientists, and we should not forget one of them at least. Who is that? Even before that, Coulomb. Okay, it's a Coulomb who first mentioned that the electric force is similar to gravitational force, is inversely proportional to 1 by r square. Okay, And of course, the modern way of writing this electric force as charge times electric field is because of Maxwell. Okay. So if I now put this F electric field, so the displacement of the ray, now I just used this D electric, which is E times E LL by mv square. Again, now if I, instead of electric field, if I use the magnetic force and you exert it by a constant magnetic field B, then what happens, this magnetic force, and I don't know if you know that the magnetic force is charge times velocity times the magnetic field. Okay, have you derived this thing? Okay, so this is because now this is because someone called Weber, and before that Oersted. All these people were studying the effect of, so at that time they were thinking about if electricity and magnetism are related. And it was Oersted who first understood that if an electric current flows through a wire, then it deflects a magnetic needle. So current electricity produces a magnetic field, and also a magnetic field is related to an electric current. So this formula comes from, you can think of it as this way, that if I have two current conducting wire, okay, an electric current, so the current is conducting, and then the magnetic field is always produced because of the, I'm sorry. Which one is problematic? The screen, right? Is there a speaker? Oh, okay. Anyway, so the magnetic field that we see is always in the perpendicular direction of the flow of the current. And now if I place another current carrying wire, then it will feel the force because of this magnetic field, and that force is also perpendicular to both of them, the direction of the magnetic field and the direction of the current. So the force is perpendicular to both of them, and from there we can write down the force as length of the wire times the current of flowing through the wire times the magnetic field. Okay, so how long the wire is and how much current is flowing and what is the strength of this magnetic field will be given by this force. And now you write this length of the wire as the velocity of the charged particle because of which the current is flowing, divide into time, and then the current is charge per unit time, and then the magnetic field. So the force is equal to the charge times the velocity of the charged particle because of which the current is flowing through the wire, and then the magnetic field. Okay. So with this simple idea, now I am going to write down the deflection of this cathode ray because of this magnetic field. So all I have to do, so this V will cancel out. So EB LL by MV. Okay. So now Thomson had these two deflection of the cathode ray, and remember he is measuring this thing also experimentally, and this is my theoretical analysis, and then I have to extract the parameters, that the unknown parameters, by comparing this theory and the experiment. So if I take the ratio of these two deflection as is given here, the ratio you take the ratio deflection because of magnetic field and deflection because of electric field, So this will be B times V by E. So from this, I can actually find out the velocity of the ray, which should be E by B times the ratio of the deflection. So again I replace this V in this deflection. So now I can write down this expression only in terms of the deflection of the rays and the magnetic field and the charge. Okay, and then there is this mass. So you do it, it's already written here. So I replace this V in this magnetic deflection, and what I find, so I'll just quickly write it down. So this is from here, so EB the length divided by mass times, so this is B square E D magnetic by D electric.
Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.